Welcome to the Conspiracy Theories of Ezra Taft Benson video. So a couple of statements by other general authorities here. This is Bruce R. McConkie in Mormon Doctrine. He's talking about secret combinations. He's saying there are reliable modern reports that describe their existence amongst gangsters as part of the governments of communist countries. So there he's calling out communist countries there as being secret combinations. In some labor organizations, so maybe the liberals, and even in some religious groups. And here we have the five communist countries of the world as they exist right now in 2019. We've got Cuba, Laos, North Korea, Vietnam, and China. Okay, a statement by the Prophet David O. McKay, General Conference, October 1959. The conflict between communism and freedom is the problem of our times. It overshadows all other problems. This conflict mirrors our age, its toils, its tensions, its troubles, and its tasks. On the outcome of this conflict depends the future of mankind. So the Cold War was a serious deal, and a lot of people were really scared of communism, that they may take over the world, including the Prophet David O. McKay. And we have a statement by the Apostle M. Russell Ballard, 1997. He's also talking about secret combinations. He says they have secret signs and code words. They participate in secret rites and initiation ceremonies, kind of like the Knights Templar pictured above, or I'm sure you can think of some other religions that do the same kind of things. Okay, some precursory statements here by Ezra Taft Benson, and then we'll pretty much go in chronological order. This is the Apostle Benson in 1966, BYU devotional. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have been close to the godless evil of the socialist communist conspiracy on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And that's true. He did have quite a bit of experience traveling around in some communist countries. He's been close to the godless evil of the socialist communist conspiracy. And another statement by Benson, 1966, BYU devotional. Who is directing the communist conspiracy? Well, he tells us it is Satan himself through his earthly followers that is directing the communist conspiracy. Okay, a 1964 statement. The day will come when the Constitution will be endangered and hang as it were by a single thread. Okay, a statement by Apostle Benson, Salt Lake Tribune, 1966. The greatest evil in the world is the communist conspiracy. Okay, a statement in 1980 in his popular speech, The 14 Fundamentals in Following the Prophet, BYU. Those who would remove profits from politics would take God out of the government. So he wants the apostles and the prophets to be involved in government. Okay, a few more statements here, and then we'll go in chronological order all the way up to the present time. Ezra Taft Benson says, no nation which has kept the commandments of God has ever perished. But I say to you, once freedom is lost, only blood, human blood, will bring it back. So he's not opposed to bloodshed and war to protect freedom or maybe to fight against conspiracies. Okay, so the conspiracy has a lot of tentacles. And here's a statement, another BYU devotional, 1966. He's saying you can't trust the news media or some of our officials and even some of our educators, because the communist conspiracy has gotten into them. So let's read this whole thing. Have you ever counted the cost if our countrymen, and especially the body of the priesthood, continue to remain complacent, misled through some of our news media, deceived by some of our officials, and perverted by some of our educators? Are you prepared to see some of your loved ones murdered? That's a harsh statement. Are you prepared to see some of your loved ones murdered? Your remaining liberties abridged, the church persecuted, and your eternal reward jeopardized. Okay, in a statement, he's now the prophet. This is General Conference, October 1988. Wickedness is rapidly expanding in every segment of our society. It is more highly organized, more cleverly disguised, and more powerfully promoted than ever before. Secret combinations lusting for power, gain, and glory are flourishing. A secret combination that seeks to overthrow the freedom of all lands, nations, and countries is increasing its evil influence and control over America and the entire world. Secret combinations that wants to overthrow our freedom, basically communists. All right, so the Apostle Ezra Taft Benson actually made the cover of Time magazine. Kind of interesting. Because he was the 15th U.S. Secretary of Agriculture for about 8 years under the President Dwight D. Eisenhower. We're not going to go into that too much, but I wanted to show the cover of Time magazine. Okay, so we'll start going by chronological order here. We're going to start in 1957. This is from the Professor Matthew Harris. He's done a lot of work on this topic that we're going to be talking about in this video. I appreciate his work. This was an article in the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. He said that Apostle Benson thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was a product of the communist conspiracy. And we have a book here by J. Edgar Hoover. Of course, he was the FBI director for quite a while in the 1950s. This book was a big influence on the Apostle Ezra Taft Benson. It's called Masters of Deceit, The Story of Communism in America and How to Fight It. Came out in 1958, and Benson said that this book was a must-read. And here you can see the subtitle blown up. Again, it's The Story of Communism in America and How to Fight It. And in the book, Hoover expressed alarm at how the Communist Party had used the Negro to exploit him and use him as a tool to build a communist America. And that's an idea that Ezra Taft Benson got from the book. And in 1960, Ezra Taft Benson put out his own book, one of the very early ones. It's from Deseret Book, 1960, 35 pages. It's called The Threat of Communism, World Brotherhood. Okay, a talk here, 1960, Apostle Benson. I am convinced that the pending civil rights legislation is about 10% civil rights, only 10%, and about 90% a further extension of socialistic federal controls. It is part of the pattern for the communist takeover of America. That is, the pending civil rights legislation was going to lead to the communist conspiracy. Okay, the Apostle Benson proposed to the BYU president, Ernest Wilkinson, that his son, Reed Benson, be used for espionage on the church school campus to find communist-leaning teachers and professors. Now, Ernest Wilkinson was also very conservative and concerned about communism, so I think he went along with this idea. Ernest Wilkinson's diary, November 29, 1960. Okay, the great historian Dr. D. Michael Quinn, in Dialogue, A Journal of Mormon Thought, he says, Apostle Benson's encouragement for espionage at BYU would be implemented periodically during the 1960s and 70s. Would be implemented. So this was done. It was done by members and advocates of the John Birch Society and maybe Reed Benson, Benson's son. Okay, and then in 1961, another book came out. This was by John J. Stewart. Mormonism versus Communism, Today's Most Vital Issue. And it had a foreword by Ezra Taft Benson. It was Mercury Publishing, 1961, 93 pages. And here you can see the bottom of the book blown up, and there it says, Foreword by Ezra Taft Benson, probably from one of his talks. Okay, the Apostle Benson, a talk entitled Secret Combinations, October 1961 General Conference. He says, in the ancient American civilization, there was no word which struck greater terror to the hearts of the people than the name of the Gadiantons. It was a secret political party which operated as a murder cult. Its object was to infiltrate the legitimate government, plant its officers in high places, and then seize power and live off the spoils that were appropriated from the people. And that's what he was worried about happening to America. Okay, a little tidbit of information here. This is the Apostle Benson in 1961. He's giving a talk in Los Angeles. Benson alleged that the Department of Agriculture had the first communist cell. He was particularly concerned about Alger Hiss. He thought Alger Hiss was a communist infiltrating the American government in the Department of Agriculture. And at this time, there was a society. It was called the John Birch Society that Ezra Taft Benson was really into. David O. McKay would not let him join it, but his wife joined. Two of his sons joined. I think his daughter joined. Just a little background on this. We're not going to go into the John Birch Society very much, but just as a little background for a few slides. The John Birch Society is an advocacy group supporting anti-communism and limited government. So kind of on the right. It has been described as a radical right and far right organization. Radical right. And another book that was really influential for the Apostle Benson was the Blue Book. It was published by the John Birch Society. The author was Robert Welch, and he went on to have a lot of influence over Benson with his ideas. This was published in 1961, 178 pages. And Benson would quote from this book quite a bit in a lot of his talks at BYU, General Conference, and in state conferences. Okay, from the David O. McKay Journal in 1961, Benson was also concerned about the fluoridating of the water supply. It said that Benson also thought that the federal government wanted to fluoridate the water supply. And there's also a letter to Henry Eyring in 1972 that talks about this. Okay, the Apostle Benson, 1961 General Conference. No true Latter-day Saint and no true American can be a socialist or a communist or support programs leading in that direction. And another passage from this General Conference, October 1961, Benson also said that there was a secret alliance between the Social Democrats and the hardcore communist conspiracy, a secret alliance. And Benson said that the alliance was facilitated by communists in high places in the government who had given away vital military secrets. So there was already communists who had penetrated the American government, and they had given away vital military secrets. This is an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, 1961. And then in December 1961, in the Deseret News, Benson claimed that there was an insidious infiltration of communist agents and sympathizers into almost every segment of American life. An insidious infiltration of communists, including the government, education, and communications, and that they occupy some of the highest offices in the land. So that's quite a bit. The communists have infiltrated into the government, into the education, and into the media. And then Benson had another book that came out. It was called The Red Carpet. This came out in 1962. Subtitle is A Forthright Evaluation of the Rising Tide of Socialism, The Royal Road to Communism. So socialism leads to communism. This is a book by Benson. 1962, 325 pages. And amazingly, Benson sent this book to all 535 members of Congress. And also in this year, 1962, J. Edgar Hoover had another book that came out. It was called A Study of Communism, 212 pages, and Benson also recommended this book. And in the book, the FBI Director Hoover, he called the civil rights movement a communist front group which acted as a main sphere for the communist agenda. This was an idea that Benson would take and run with as well. The civil rights movement is a communist front group which acted as a main sphere for the communist agenda. And in another General Conference talk, 1962, Benson said that our educational systems, our institutions, had been infiltrated by socialists. So he says, we must protect this American base from the brainwashing increasingly administered to our youth in the many educational institutions across the land by some misinformed instructors and some wolves in sheep's clothing. Their false indoctrination, often perpetuated behind the front of so-called academic freedom, is leaving behind many faithless students, socialist-oriented, who are easy subjects for state tyranny. Okay, also in 1962, Apostle Benson said that Senator Joseph McCarthy rendered a service in emphasizing the insidious threat of the communist influence in government. McCarthy rendered a service. He's pointing out the insidious threat of the communist influence in government. This was a letter from Benson to H. Roland Tietjen, president of the Hawaiian Temple. Okay, the Apostle Benson, 1962 here in the book The Red Carpet. He is quoting from the Don Smoot Report. I think that's Don Smoot. Benson believed that there was a one world government conspiracy going on as well, and he said United States membership in the United Nations has caused a perversion of our fundamental concepts of government. We cannot restore Americanism. We cannot have an American policy, either foreign or domestic. We cannot reestablish America as a free and independent constitutional republic until we withdraw from the United Nations. He wanted America to withdraw from the United Nations. He looked at the United Nations as a conspiracy group for one world government. Okay, and Apostle Benson's son, Reed Benson, was also into all these conspiracy theories, and he also worked for the John Birch Society. This was a letter from Reed to David O. McKay in 1963. It's regarding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And Reed Benson says that the NAACP is a communist front group. And again, the Apostle Benson, in a speech, 1963 at the John Birch Society anniversary, Benson says, for 30 years, we have aided the cause of the atheistic socialist conspiracy by permitting the socialist, communists, and fellow travelers into high places in government. So these communists had infiltrated into the high places of government in the U.S. And then in 1963, Benson had another book that came out. It was called The Threat to Our Freedom, basically communism. Deseret book, 1963, 35 pages. And another one that came out in 1963 by Benson, it was called A Nation Asleep, put out by Bookcraft. That's a church publisher, LDS Church. 1963, 59 pages. This is more of an obscure one. And also in 1963, another book came out, / pamphlet, by W. Cleon Skousen. It's called The Communist Attack on the John Birch Society. And Benson recommended this pamphlet. It was Ensign Publishing, 1963, 16 pages. And here you can see the title blown up bigger. Again, it's the Communist Attack on the John Birch Society, that far-right group. And here you can see the author's name blown up bigger, W. Cleon Skousen. He was buddies with Benson. They shared a lot of the same ideology and conspiracy theories. And also in 1963, the book The Politician came out. This is by the president of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch. And Benson endorsed this book. It's called The Politician. The book claimed that the U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general, the book claimed that Dwight D. Eisenhower was a communist. And this was a view that Benson would share with Robert Welch. It's kind of a crazy belief, considering that Benson spent 8 years in Eisenhower's cabinet as the Secretary of Agriculture. But this book had a big impact on Benson, and he believed it. And this is in a Benson letter to Joseph Fielding Smith, July 31st, 1963. All right, so this book entitled The Politician by Robert Welch, pictured here above, it argues that Eisenhower and his communist bosses and their pro-communist appointees were gradually taking over the U.S. government and doing so right under the noses of the American people. Eisenhower in league with the communists, taking over the U.S. government. Robert Welch also claimed that the U.S. was 50 to 70% under communist control, and Benson shared these views. And the book also theorized that Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson were unwitting communist dupes. So both Kennedy and Johnson were communist dupes as well. And Benson believed these theories as well. He liked the book. He gave it to a lot of people, including a bunch of the general authorities, I believe. And Welch also claimed that Martin Luther King belonged to 60 Communist Front organizations. Yep, you heard it here. Martin Luther King belonged to 60 Communist Front organizations. And so in the October 1963 General Conference, Apostle Benson called members of the church to come to the aid of the anti-communist patriots, programs, and organizations, groups like the John Birch Society, the anti-communist. Come to their aid and get involved. And in the same talk, Apostle Benson said that communism is state slavery and from the Antichrist. So again, Satan is the director and leader of the communists. Okay, so Benson was also against school integration, whites with blacks. In this article, Benson says black is red. Benson says black is red. Basically, the blacks are commies. In the Daily Utah Chronicle in 1963, in the address to Southern whites of the New Orleans Stake, Apostle Benson condemns the U.S. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy for sending federal troops to aid school integration of African Americans in the South. So he was against school integration of African Americans in the South. Another article here, Elder Benson links the Reds to civil rights furor. Deseret News, 1963. Apostle Benson gave a talk where he said that the American civil rights movement is phony and actually part of the pattern for the communist takeover of America. All right, so in the same speech, I guess it was called We Must Become Alerted and Informed, Benson predicted that within 10 years, the United States would be ruled by a communist dictatorship, which will include military occupation, concentration camps, tortures, terror, and all that is required to enable about 3% of the population to rule the other 97% as slaves. And Benson also said that we must join with those small but determined and knowledgeable patriots. Words will not stop the communists. We got to get involved. And in the same talk, Benson says that the U.S. government is becoming so infiltrated with commies that American citizens can no longer resist the communist conspiracy as free citizens, but can resist the communist tyranny only by themselves becoming conspirators against established government. So he's basically saying to turn against the U.S. government, that's treason. And Benson says that we may have to even give our lives. There may be bloodshed, may have to go to war if the time comes in order to battle communism before the godless communist conspiracy destroys our civilization. We've got to be willing to stand up and fight just like in the Revolutionary War. Okay, so there was also a book that was put out by President David O. McKay, the prophet, 1964, Deseret book, 39 pages. He was also very against communism, and he was basically allowing Benson to make all these statements, even in General Conference. And so there, you can get this book, David O. McKay's Statements on Communism and the Constitution of the United States. You can see what McKay says about communism, and we had one quote at the beginning of this video. Okay, and another book that came out in 1964 by Benson is called Title of Liberty, A Warning Voice. It was compiled by his son, Mark A. Benson. This book has quite a few of his sermons on communism and conspiracy stuff. Deseret book, 1964, 234 pages. And in this book, Benson opposes the United Nations again, asserting that it was a communist-dominated organization, the UN, designed to promote a one-world government. Yes, sir. That's what the UN is for, according to Benson. And here's the all-seeing eye, Novus Ordo Seclorum. That's on the back of the dollar bill. That means New Order of the Ages. So some conspiracy theories think that that means a new world order, or as Benson calls it, one world government. And also in the book, Benson opposes President Lyndon B. Johnson's Civil Rights Act of 1964. You can find that on pages 58, 62, and 76. Yes, Benson pretty much opposes all the civil rights acts. All right, another interesting pamphlet put out by Benson. It is called Conspiracy Plus Complacency Equals Disaster. Then it has a big bomb going off. Boom! Deseret book, 1965, 30-page pamphlet. All right, so Apostle Benson also opposed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War. So Benson says, well, let's just keep those discriminatory voting practices in place because it's a communist conspiracy. He's against all these acts. So the Apostle Benson said the following in the April 1965 General Conference. Moving along here in the chronology, 1965 now. Benson said, before I left for Europe, I warned how the communists were using the civil rights movement to promote revolution and eventual takeover of this country. That's what the civil rights movement was all about, right? Ha ha ha. When are we going to wake up? Now, brethren, the Lord never promised there would not be traitors in the church. We have the ignorant, the sleepy, and the deceived, who provide temptations and avenues of apostasy for the unwary and the unfaithful. So there's kind of a battle going on between Benson and Hugh B. Brown. Hugh B. Brown was actually a lot more for the civil rights movement, and Benson was against it. So I bet Benson would call Hugh B. Brown, who was in the first presidency, he would call him ignorant, sleepy, and deceived. Okay, so the official publication of the April 1965 conference talk deleted Benson's reference to LDS traitors like Hugh B. Brown. Deleted it, as well as his assessment of the civil rights movement as communist and revolutionary. Those were deleted, a common practice for Benson's talks. So Benson agreed with the following statement by Robert Welch. And Welch said, fully expose the civil rights fraud. Civil rights movement was a fraud. And you will break the back of the communist conspiracy. So the riots in Watts occurred in Los Angeles in August of 1965. The riots caused millions of dollars in damage and killed 34 people. Benson said that the communists had spent 2 years in Watts agitating for the uprising. So the Watts riots were caused by the commies. Okay, and Benson's son, Reed Benson, had the following to say. It was a memo to the Utah chapters of the John Birch Society. It is common knowledge that the civil rights movement is communist-controlled, influenced, and dominated. Okay, some minutes of a council meeting November 4th, 1965. This is in Greg Prince's book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. Very good book. In the minutes, it said that Martin Luther King is an agent, if not a power, in the Communist Party. That's what Benson said anyway, and he said that the whole thing is being directed and supported and promoted by agents of the Communist Party, and that the Negroes are being used in this whole question of civil rights, integration, etc., and that the NAACP are largely made up of men who are affiliated with from 1 to a dozen communist organizations. So the NAACP affiliated maybe with up to a dozen communist front organizations. All right, so in 1966, who was the recognized leader of the civil rights movement? Well, it was Martin Luther King. We know that Benson was talking about Martin Luther King in this speech. BYU Devotional, 1966. He says, the man who is generally recognized as the leader of the so-called civil rights movement today in America is a man who has lectured at a communist training school. He's talking about MLK. And he likes to say the so-called civil rights movement because he doesn't believe that that's what it's all about. So he says MLK lectured at a communist training school. He has also solicited funds through communist sources. He has hired a communist as his top-level aide, and he has affiliated with communist fronts, who is often praised in the communist press, that's MLK, praised in the communist press, and who unquestionably parallels the communist line. This same man advocates the breaking of the law and has been described by J. Edgar Hoover as the most notorious liar in the country. So that's what Benson thinks of MLK. All right, so the Apostle Benson is set apart as a prophet, seer, and revelator. So he should be able to prophesy, right? Well, here he's given us a little bit of prophecy. BYU Devotional 1966. I warn you, unless we wake up soon and do something about the conspiracy of the communist-inspired civil rights riots of the past, Watts, that's the riots in L.A., will pale into insignificance compared to the bloodshed and destruction that lie ahead in the near future. So I guess we did wake up, huh? And we did do something about the conspiracy of the communist-inspired civil rights riots? Well, no. Civil rights got passed. It was a good thing for the country. So is it a false prophecy? Yeah, I'd probably say yeah. All right, so speaking a little bit of truth here, this is from the Thunder from the Right book, Matthew L. Harris. He says, there is no credible evidence that Martin Luther King or his associates were communists. King actually condemned communism. So that's probably a lot more according to the truth. Just wanted to throw that in there in case you were starting to believe any of this stuff. Okay, so this is an interesting one. In 1967, the Apostle Benson approved the use of a recent talk as a foreword to an overtly racist book which featured the decapitated and profusely bleeding head of an African American on its cover. He gave a foreword to an overtly racist book, and we're going to see the cover on the next slide. It was entitled The Black Hammer, A Study of Black Power, Red Influence, and White Alternatives. Interesting title there, right? What are the alternatives for the white people? That's just racist right there in the subtitle. Foreword by the Honorable Ezra Taft Benson. It was a book written by Wes Andrews and Clyde Dalton. Okay, so here is the cover. We have the hammer and the sickle. That's the communist symbol. The sickle has sliced through the neck of a black person. The neck is profusely bleeding into a pile of blood. So I guess it's the idea that the communists are using the black people, maybe using the civil rights movement for their own agenda, and maybe even willing to kill the black people for their own agenda, their communist conspiracy and influence. Who knows if Benson knew that this was the cover of the book before he gave his permission for his talk to be used in the foreword. Maybe he saw it, maybe he didn't. He didn't really have very sympathetic views to black people, so. And here is more of a close-up here, the hammer, the sickle, and the head with the blood spilling down. Pretty gruesome cover. And here is the top of the cover. I put a box around the part where it says foreword by the Honorable Ezra Taft Benson. And here is the subtitle in bigger text, a study of black power, red influence, and white alternatives. Just from the title, I'm willing to bet they're against segregation. What are the white alternatives for dealing with these blacks? I haven't read this book. I read the foreword by Benson. Okay, so a little bit more about this book. This is from D. Michael Quinn again. Ezra Taft Benson and Mormon Political Conflicts and Dialogue. He says that the Black Hammer book dismisses as communist-directed all organized efforts for civil rights. Any efforts for civil rights were communist-directed. The book warns about the violent revolt, which is part of the 100-year-old communist program for the enslavement of America, using the Negroes to revolt, which is part of the program of the commies to enslave the United States. And the book is also about the well-defined plans for the establishment of a Negro Soviet dictatorship in the South. So the Negroes would have their own country in the South, run by the commies, run by the Soviets. The book also talks about the Negroes' need. The book talks about the Negroes' need for complete subservience to the great white fathers in Washington. That is overtly racist. the Negro's need for complete subservience to the great white fathers in Washington, D.C. So the fact that Benson put his forward into this book, I don't know if he read the book, the fact that his forward is on this book is pretty appalling. All right, in 1967, the Apostle Benson asked the prophet David O. McKay for permission to speak on how the communists are using the Negroes to foment trouble in the United States. And this is from Gregory Prince's book again. All right, so the Apostle Benson believed in the curse of Cain, the curse that came upon Cain when he slew his brother Abel, curse of a black skin. He admits to this in a general conference in 1967. The arm of flesh may not approve nor understand why God has not bestowed the priesthood on women or the seed of Cain, which is black people. Black people could not have the priesthood, nor could they go to the temple. But God's ways are not man's ways. It's not for us to question it. We may not understand it. It's a mystery. But God's ways are not man's ways. The prophet Joseph Smith understood the principle when he said, "The curse is not yet taken off from the sons of Canaan," curse of Cain, a black skin, "neither will be until it is affected by as great a power as caused it to come." So this might be one explanation for why Ezra Taft Benson was a racist. Okay, the same conference, October 1967. There is no doubt that the so-called civil rights movement, as it exists today, is used as a communist program for revolution in America. The so-called civil rights movement. So he doesn't even believe that it is the civil rights movement. It's something else. It's a communist conspiracy. And again in the same conference, the communist program for revolution in America has been in progress for many years and is far advanced. All right, in the same conference again, we must insist that duly authorized legislative investigating committees launch an even more exhaustive study and expose the secret communists who are directing the civil rights movement. People like McCarthy. All right, the same conference again. This talk had a lot of material in it for this video. We need a vast awakening, considering the degree to which the controlling influences of the federal government and the communications media are now furthering this communist revolution. So he's saying a lot of controls in the federal government have been overtaken by commies, and the communications media, probably the TV, the radio, etc., are also under communist influence. And in this general conference, October 1967, Benson said that everybody should read this book. It's written by Gary Allen. I think he was a member of the John Birch Society, and he wrote several books on conspiracy theories. This one is called Communist Revolution in the Streets. So it's probably about the civil rights movement being controlled by commies. And it's interesting to note that there's an introduction by W. Cleon Skousen. He was a Mormon that also wrote some conspiracy books. He wrote the intro to it. And Benson said that everybody should read this. So here you can see the bottom of the book. It says, with an introduction by W. Cleon Skousen. Okay, so here is a page from the book. It's the chapter Black Nationalism. An all-Negro nation is one of the principal goals. So again, the idea of setting up a separate black nation in the South run by the Soviets or the commies. Remarkably, both of Benson's church-authorized biographies omit this October 1967 address, from which we've got so much material from. They don't even mention it. One of the authorized biographies is by Sherry Dew. I'll go over that on another slide. And there's this one here, Francis Gibbons, statesman, patriot, prophet of God. Doesn't even mention this kind of stuff. Francis Gibbon's biographies of general authorities are basically worthless if you're trying to find anything controversial about any of these general authorities. Okay, let's talk about George C. Wallace for a minute. He was the governor of Alabama. He is best remembered for his staunch segregationist and populist views. Wallace was known as the most dangerous racist in America, and he notoriously opposed desegregation, and supported the policies of Jim Crow during the Civil Rights Movement. He declared in his 1963 inaugural address that he stood for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And Wallace also claimed that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came straight out of the Communist Manifesto that was written by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. This from the book Prisoners of Hope, 2016. So Wallace seems like the kind of guy you'd want to avoid. Well, not for Benson. Benson tried to become Wallace's vice presidential candidate when Wallace ran for president of the United States. Benson wanted to be Wallace's VP candidate, amazingly enough. And according to the Christian Science Monitor, Benson also supported Wallace. This is in D. Michael Quinn's work in the Dialogue, A Journal of Mormon Thought, and in the Christian Science Monitor in 1968. So Benson didn't have too much sympathy for Martin Luther King when he died. Benson had the following to say immediately upon his death. Benson said, "The communists will use Mr. King's death for as much yardage as possible." And he also said that Martin Luther King had been affiliated with at least 3 communist fronts. This is the Apostle Benson, a memo to general authorities. And the Apostle Benson did not want Martin Luther King to be made a martyr, so he protested President Lyndon B. Johnson's executive order to lower the flags at half-mast upon his death. This is from Matthew L. Harris's article and book, Thunder from the Right. And Benson also vilified Martin Luther King as a liar and a disreputable person. This also from the same memo to the general authorities. Okay, so in the same month, there was a letter from Benson, April 18, 1968. This is in the David O. McKay papers. Benson condemned the civil rights movement in a letter to the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 entitled Dangers Ahead. The letter expressed his fear of black militants and said that the communist conspiracy was now in its final stages. He said that black Marxists would usher in a revolution, collapse America's financial institutions, and plunge the nation into a recession or a depression. He said these black Marxists, basically socialists or commies, or the Soviet Union Marxists, would lead to the possible outbreak of World War III. Okay, about a month after Martin Luther King died, his assassination, the Apostle Benson gave a BYU devotional speech in which he accused the U.S. Supreme Court of treason and mentioned the communists and their black power fanatics. May 21, 1968, BYU devotional. And in the same BYU devotional, he said that the communists have penetrated every major segment of our society, including the news media, the schools, the churches, the unions, etc. That's pretty much conspiracy theories right there. And in another general conference address, Benson described the U.S. government welfare state programs as a communist planned program of deception. So welfare programs like Medicaid, unemployment, disability, food stamps, Social Security, and Pell Grants, etc. These welfare state programs are a communist planned program of deception. Okay, and then in 1969, Benson had another book that came out. It was called An Enemy Hath Done This. An Enemy Hath Done This. Sounds like a pretty good conspiracy title. Parliament Publishers, so it was not Deseret Book on this one, 1969 and 370 pages, so that's pretty large book. Okay, so in this book, Benson claims that the Vietnam War was a subterfuge or a deceit to mask the domestic agendas of President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, to mask their domestic agendas, which were calculated to foist communism on the American people. So also in this book, An Enemy Hath Done This, Benson blamed the death of JFK on liberals because they had coddled the communists by being tolerant, broad-minded, and working for peace, but in reality they had been pampering, protecting, and promoting the very nest of serpents which produced Lee Harvey Oswald, the communist who killed JFK. Okay, so in the same book, Benson says, the communists are following a far more subtle and potentially successful plan of internal takeover, using a combination of riots, revolution, and parallel political manipulations to convert our government into a totalitarian regime, which then can be merged comfortably into a one-world government. Benson also believed that President Richard Nixon was soft on communism. He criticized Nixon for failing to end treasonous trading between many American businesses and the enemy. And he's talking about China here, as Nixon opened up trade between the U.S. and China. These are in two letters from Benson to Nixon, one in 1971, one in 1969. So at the April 1972 General Conference, Apostle Benson recommended that all members of the church read Gary Allen's New World Order book, which was called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which came out a year previous in 1971. Speech was called Civic Standards for the Faithful Saints. The LDS Church has removed this fact from the text of the speech on their website currently in 2019. However, if you watch the video, you can see and hear him say it at the 12:30 minute mark. Okay, so in the book, Gary Allen asserts that the modern political and economic systems in most developed nations are the result of a sweeping conspiracy by the establishment's power elite. Sweeping conspiracy by the establishment's power elite, for which he also uses the term insiders. According to the author, these insiders use elements of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto to forward their socialist and communist agenda. And it's in four parts here. Number one is to establish an income tax system as a means of extorting money from the common man. Number two, establish a central bank deceptively named so that people will think that it's part of the government. In the U.S. case, it's the Federal Reserve Bank. Number three, have this bank be the holder of the national debt. Number four, run the national debt and the interest thereon sky high through wars or any sort of deficit spending, as the socialists like to do, social spending, like Medicare. This started in World War I, which caused a lot of debt and interest for these insiders. And here is the cover of the book. It is called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. It was by Gary Allen with Larry Abraham, so I guess he helped out on it. Introduction by the Congressman John G. Smits. It's an international bestseller, over 5 million in print, so that's a lot. Benson liked this, and he recommended this book in General Conference. Okay, so in the same speech in General Conference, Benson said, the position of this church on the subject of communism has never changed. We consider it the greatest satanical threat to the peace, prosperity, and spread of God's work among man that exists on the face of the earth. It's the greatest satanical threat to our peace, prosperity, and the spread of the work of the church. Again, this is the Apostle Benson. He's quoting from the prophet David O. McKay. And the LDS Church has removed this passage from the text of the speech on their website. However, you can see him say it at the 10-20 minute mark in the video. Okay, so in the same speech in General Conference, the Apostle Benson continues, and he also recommends the book The Naked Communist, which came out in 1958, and it was written by the Mormon writer W. Cleon Skousen. He shared a lot of the same ideology with Benson. The book supposedly shows us how the Marxist-Leninist Soviet Union is attempting to implement a geopolitical strategy to overcome and control all of the world's governments that are not members of the communist bloc. So basically, to have a one world government, but it would be a communist government and take over the whole world. The LDS Church has removed this fact from the text of the speech, the fact that he recommends this book. It's not in the text, but however, if you watch the video, you can see him say it or hear him say it at the 10:40 minute mark. And here's the cover. I think this is a later edition. It's The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, another conspiracy book that Benson really liked. And here is a picture of Cleon Skousen, the Mormon writer. He was a pretty popular writer and had a number of books. And the prophet David O. McKay also recommended the Naked Communist book in General Conference. This was a speech October 1959, I guess, and then it also showed up here in the Improvement Era. All right, so Benson continues in the same speech, General Conference, April 1972. There is no question that our nation is increasingly upholding the communist conspiracy today by court edict. Communists can run for government office, teach in our schools, hold office in our labor unions, work in our defense plants, serve in our merchant marines, and so forth. As a nation, we are helping, it would seem, to underwrite communist revolutionaries in our own country. And this was removed from the text of the speech again on the church's website. However, if you watch the video, you can hear him say it at the 13:20 minute mark. All right, so the Apostle Benson continues in the same speech. He says, the Book of Mormon has singled out the greatest threat as the godless conspiracy. There is no conspiracy theory in the Book of Mormon. It is a conspiracy fact. And since the Book of Mormon was written for our day, the conspiracy theories in the Book of Mormon should warn us about conspiracy theories going on now in the U.S. government. John Taylor had an interesting statement in the Journal of Discourses 1881 about Joseph Smith and secret combinations. He said, these secret combinations were spoken of by Joseph Smith years and years ago. I have heard him time and time again tell about them, and he stated that when these things began to take place, that the liberties of this nation would begin to be bartered away. And it's interesting to note that Joseph Smith established his own secret combination, the Council of 50, and that was basically to have a theocracy, to run the government, the economy, and the church. So maybe he's establishing a secret combination to combat other secret combinations in the country. All right, Benson again, October 1973 General Conference. In the speech, Watchmen warn the wicked, and Benson is definitely the watchman, and he's warning the wicked and the saints. Benson says, effort will be made to lull us away into a false security. Proposals will be and are being offered, and programs are sponsored that have wide appeal. Attractive labels are usually attached to the most dangerous programs, often in the name of public welfare and personal security. Let us not be misled. Okay, so in the book, The Mormon Corporate Empire, there was an interview of Benson. It was February 1974. He was asked during the interview if a good Mormon could also be a liberal Democrat. Can a good Mormon also be a liberal Democrat? Benson replied, I think that it would be very hard if he was living the gospel and he understood it. All right, so Benson put out another book in 1975 It was called A Plea for America. A Deseret book, 32 pages, so you could also call this a pamphlet. All right, so Benson also thought that President Jimmy Carter was a socialist or a commie. So he pretty much thinks that all the presidents are commies. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and now Carter, all commies. He didn't like President Jimmy Carter's policies on the welfare state and Social Security. He called these policies legalized plunder, and he said these policies were taking the country into full-scale socialism. This is from the Salt Lake Tribune. Okay, a speech at BYU again, 1977. He says, another notable counterfeit system to the Lord's plan is collectivized socialism. Both communism and socialism have the same effect upon the individual, a loss of personal liberty. Compulsory benevolence is not charity. Today's socialists, who call themselves egalitarians, we want equal rights movement, etc., egalitarians, are using the federal government to redistribute wealth in our society. Not as a matter of voluntary charity, but as a so-called matter of right. And Benson was also convinced that the Russian KGB, it's kind of like our CIA, the KGB had infiltrated the U.S. government. Benson believed that the KGB was influencing actions and policies of the intelligence community, the Congress, and the president and his staff. This is from Professor Matthew Harris in an article in the John Whitmer Association Journal. Okay, so jumping a few years ahead, on November 11th, 1985, Ezra Taft Benson became the prophet of the Mormon Church. He started to tone down his communist rhetoric and his conspiracy theories. He was 86 years old when he became the prophet. Due to health problems, Benson was only active in speaking and traveling for about 3 years. And he was getting pretty old and, kind of calming down on the conspiracy theories as a prophet. But he still did speak about secret combinations from time to time. This is General Conference in 1986, October. He says, from the Book of Mormon, we see the evils of secret combinations portrayed in graphic and chilling reality. Secret combinations portrayed in graphic and chilling reality. One secret combination is the Masons. They have secret handshakes and secret passwords and whatnot. Here's an example. What is that? The pass grip of a fellow craft. Has it a name? It has. Will you give it to me? I did not so receive it, neither will I so impart it. So the Freemasons, a secret combination. Evil or good? Probably mostly good. All right, the biography, Ezra Taft Benson by Sherry L. Dew. This is the official LDS biography that most Mormons have read. Deseret book, 1987, maybe a year after he had became prophet. 565 pages, so it should be comprehensive, right? Wrong. The Mormon writer, Sherry L. Dew, probably a true believing Mormon, left a lot out. Believe it or not, there is not one mention of the John Birch Society. There's very little mention of his communist ideas, his anti-civil rights ideas. Basically, a lot, and I'd probably say most of the stuff in this video is not in this book. It's left out. It's an apologetic biography, as the church likes to do, and the Francis Gibbons ones is no better. Sherry L. Dew is the executive vice president of the Deseret Management Corporation and CEO of the Deseret Book Company nowadays. So she did a nice apologetic biography and left out most of the interesting stuff. Okay, so another statement by the Prophet Benson. He's now the Prophet. General Conference, October 1988. I testify that wickedness is rapidly expanding in every segment of our society. It is more highly organized, more cleverly disguised, and more powerfully promoted than ever before. Secret combinations are lusting for power, gain, and glory are flourishing. Secret combinations. So he's toning down the rhetoric. He's not using the word communist. He's using the words secret combinations. All right. So Benson's last talk that he gave in person. I think there was 2 more talks given by Hinckley and Monson. But Benson did not give them in General Conference. They were read by Hinckley and Monson. Maybe he wrote them, maybe he didn't. He was getting frail. He'd had strokes and cerebral hemorrhages, and this was his last talk, so the rest of his presidency was kind of laying around in his home in his bed, being taken care of. Anyway, in this last talk, he says, a secret combination that seeks to overthrow the freedom of all lands, nations, and countries is increasing its evil influence and control over America and the entire world. A secret combination, its evil influence to control America and the entire world, a one-world government. So he's not calling it communism, but we know that's what he means based on the historical talks he's given during his life. You can compare this, I guess, with Ether, Chapter 8. This was a speech called I Testify by the Prophet Ezra Benson. 1988, October General Conference, his last talk in person. All right, the Prophet Ezra Taft Benson again. He says, our leaders in Washington have been acting as though the American people elected them to office for the primary purpose of leading the entire planet toward international peace, prosperity, and a one-world government. Well, wouldn't that be nice? International peace, no more war, prosperity for everyone, even third-world countries, and maybe a one-world government. Could be a good thing, but Benson really didn't like it, and he wanted to keep America separate. He says, at times, these men appear to be more concerned with something called world opinion or with their image as world leaders than they are with securing the best possible advantage for us. So he's not very keen on international programs, even if they lead to peace, I guess. He wants to keep the sovereignty of the United States, keep it separate from the rest of the world. Doesn't want the leaders of the United States to be worried about world opinion or world programs like the UN. All right, October 1989 General Conference. The Prophet Benson says, pride results in secret combinations which are built up to get power, gain, and the glory of the world. Pride results in secret combinations. Secret combinations brought down both the Jaredite and the Nephite civilizations and have been and will yet be the cause of the fall of many nations. And he was worried about the U.S. falling to these secret combinations. Great book to read, Secret Combinations, Evidence of Early Mormon Counterfeiting, 1800 to 1847. All right, Malcolm Jepson, a member of the 70, a general authority doing some apologetics. He publicly chastised extreme right-wing Mormons, like Benson, for taking out of context isolated statements by President Benson, which were given in talks years ago when the world situation was different. So his talks were taken out of context. They love to use that one. But as you can see from this video, that's not true. I got a ton of proof for Benson's extreme right-wing views and his love of the John Birch Society, although we didn't go into that too much. This was a talk that he gave, We Shall Not Be Led Astray, 1991, to various state conferences in Utah and Idaho. All right, a pamphlet that came out in 1992. It is entitled The New World Order, An Analysis for Latter-day Saints, from the teachings of Ezra Taft Benson. It's published by the Mormon writer R. Gary Shapiro. Shapiro warns the Mormons about an international conspiracy to rule the world, a one-world government or a new world order. It's from the teachings of Ezra Taft Benson. Okay, a couple of articles in the Salt Lake Tribune. This is in 1992. In view of the preoccupation with conspiracies, it is probably not surprising that President Benson's administration encouraged a special church committee to monitor and maintain surveillance files on academics, intellectuals, and others assumed to be critics of the church. This was known as the Strengthening of the Members Committee, and this happened during the Prophet Benson's administration, probably looking for commies and other people that were going against the church. All right, so a little bit about the Strengthening the Members Committee, a little more. I guess Christofferson, Zwick, Robbins, and Evans were this committee for a time. I don't know if they still are. Says the picture from above is from a leaked church document. Anyway, this is from the Deseret News, 1993. Remember, this was done under Benson's leadership. Elder Oaks, it's probably Dallin H. Oaks, explained that local leaders are informed by church headquarters about members who may possibly be violating church standards. The church's Strengthening the Members Committee pores over newspapers and other publications and identifies members accused of crimes, preaching false doctrine, criticizing the leadership, which they really hate. The leaders really hate to be criticized, like what I'm doing, or other problems. That information is forwarded on to the person's bishop or stake president, who is charged with helping them overcome problems and stay active in the church. So largely thanks to Benson, there is an extreme right-wing movement in the church. People like Robert E. Hales, they're still writing books about this kind of stuff. This one is Horizon Publisher, came out in 1996, 192 pages. Secret Combinations Today, A Voice of Warning. And another one of these guys is Greg West. He wrote the book, The New World Order and Other Secret Combinations of the Last Day. Cedar Fort Publisher, came out in 1998, 114 pages. And another one is Jack Monet, PhD. He wrote the book Awakening to Our Awful Situation, Warnings from the Nephite Prophets. And I think this is in two parts. The first part is Nauvoo House Publisher, came out in 2006, and 430 pages, so it has a lot more information. Forward by Joel Skousen, probably related to Cleon. And this right-wing website has a lot of information. It's at latterdayconservative.com. Educational LDS resources on freedom and liberty and Constitution and stuff like that. So Benson's legacy continues as people go back and read these old General Conference talks. All right, so here's a picture of Benson. This was from his last talk when he gave the warning to America and the whole world of the secret combinations that want to take us over. And that's going to do it for this video. And I thank you for watching the Conspiracy Theories of Ezra Taft Benson video.